Operating expenses, we all incur them, and some more than others, but I'm going to break them into two groups. First one is interest paid, and that could be margin interest or payments in lieu paid if you borrow securities and you have to pay a dividend to the person you borrowed your security from. So let's start with margin interest. If you trade on margin, you're obviously charged interest to do so. And the funds you borrow to buy the securities are directly traceable to the purchase of the security. So that makes it investment interest. Now, why did I make that point? If you buy a commercial real estate building and you put a mortgage on it, that's traceable to the operation of that building. But let's say you buy something a little bit less tangible than a building. Let's say you buy an investment in a friend's partnership and you borrow money to invest with him. But you borrow $100,000 and you put that right into the partnership. That's directly traceable to that investment in his partnership. The point here being is that if you borrow money and want to deduct it as investment interest, it has to be directly traceable to an investment. You can't take that $100,000 you borrowed to put into the partnership, take $15,000, buy a new refrigerator, and put the rest in the partnership. Then only a portion of the interest would be deductible. Investment interest is deductible as an itemized deduction. So let's keep that in mind, and we're going to set that aside for a second and talk about the other things that are investment interest. Payments in lieu, paid. When you trade on margin or sell stock short, you borrow securities to cover that short from somebody else. And if in the time that you've borrowed that security happens to pay a dividend or interest, because you can borrow bonds, you pay that amount to the person you've borrowed from to make up for their loss of that dividend or income. To them, it's an income item. To you, it's an expense. It's a payment in lieu paid. Payments in lieu paid are investment interest, and they are also deductible as investment interest as an itemized deduction. So we've talked about investment interest being an itemized deduction. If you're a taxpayer who doesn't exceed the amount, in other words, if you don't itemize, there's no deduction for you. It's also not just a one-for-one item. So in other words, if you have spent $1,000 in margin interest over the course of the year, it just doesn't go on your tax return as an itemized deduction. You must have enough investment income to offset that deduction. So if you only have $50 in dividends and interest as income on your return, you will only get to deduct $50 of that investment interest. Most of the time that doesn't happen, because if you're trading at a level where you have borrowed securities or traded on margins, you have a larger portfolio, therefore you have a larger investment piece of income. So, big things to keep in mind here. It's not all deductible, it's an itemized deduction, and it must be directly traceable to an investment. Now, what about the other expenses you might incur on your account? Account fees, advisory fees, there's some ADR fees. ADRs are securities that are foreign securities that are traded on our stock exchange as depository units, and then stock borrow and loan fees. Those are all fees, and fees is a good word here. Prior to the 2017 Tax Act, which took effect for 2018 taxes, all investment expenses of this nature were miscellaneous itemized deductions. However, in the 2017 tax law, miscellaneous itemized deductions ceased to exist. They no longer exist. So, we could talk about the past where these kind of fees had to exceed 2% of your adjusted gross income. And we've already talked about what that adjusted gross income is, so I'm not going to redefine it. But nowadays, they're just gone. They are not a deductible item. So expenses of managing your account are something to be aware of, and be sure that you're minimizing them as much as possible, because you're not going to get any tax benefit from them. In our last lesson to this course, we're going to talk about being a trader so that you can deduct these type of expenses. It's not easy, but it's something you might want to listen to.